This patch is really interesting and should do a little bit to tone down the potential dominance of tech decks. One of the really odd things about Marvel Snap is that at the top level, there just isn't a lot of use for one-drops. And I think dynamics of different costs is something that is really on my mind throughout this patch. Because to me, Zabu is kind of the big offender in why there aren't so many spaces for one-drops, and also why there are so many spaces for four-drops as the premier top end in sort of good stuff mid-range. That is something that also informs a relative lack of 5-drops, which is something we're going to be talking about this week most likely as we're looking forward to the thing first steps, who does cost 5. Zabu is a card that I would argue is primarily responsible for large, far-ranging things that happen in the metagame that aren't necessarily related to him exactly, but he does end up sort of causing the stone to fall down the mountain that turns into an avalanche. Zabu is losing 1 point of power here, going to 1-1. Largely, my worry is that that might not be enough. One of the things that I've noticed is that other one-drops are so far behind Zabu, in large part because he is the only one-drop that has a long-lasting effect on the game. I talked about this when Clea came out. There's just not a lot of competition for a one-drop that's actually good. It's Zabu, it's Hydra Bob, and then it's really not much else depending on what you're actually looking for, which is how I was getting away with playing Elektra, who is just perfectly fine. The Hood is a sort of special case. He's a one-drop that goes in a specific synergy deck, but he is the best at that role by a pretty massive amount. Once you get past that, you get to cards like Iceman or Spider-Ham, and those cards are fine, but they don't approach the impact that something like Zabu can have. There is no one-drop that is as good as getting a turn 3 4-cost card, or the ability to play multiple 4-cost cards on the final turn of the game, and that is what Zabu represents. Unfortunately, I think he still represents this. Even at 1-1, I'm not sure that's a meaningful cost to pay. What he gives you is still so powerful. So this is effectively a freebie change. They just get to do this, and it's totally fine, because why else would you make changes in a game if not to ding things that can accept the ding? I think Zabu is largely going to be a fairly similar card to what he already was. I already, especially in decks that are doubling up on buff things, for example, feel the pain of having to play him even though the reward is valuable because he takes up a spot at 2 power. That pain is now intensified with Zabu taking up a spot at 1 power. This is, of course, going to be a thing that reduces his actual output. Having to use a slot on something with 1 power is really actively bad. I can't think of a time where a 1-1 was actually good. And this could be the first time that that actually happens because Zabu, relative to other 1-drops, is just so far ahead. People tend to underestimate just how much 1 power matters, and the reason I think they underestimate it is because they don't really think enough about the impact of putting 1 power in a location where you can then only put 3 more cards the entire rest of the game. Increasing that downside to Zabu is something I think Zabu can take and still be a good card, which means it's definitely something they should do. I think I also want to take this time to talk about the ways in which Zabu influences other costs. Zabu being a card that influences 4 costs specifically, and allowing 4-cost cards to be played alongside other big meaningful threats on turn 6 is largely the thing that bothers me the most. What this does effectively is, when you really look at what 4-cost cards are, is it prevents them from making cards that scale well at 4 in case they get played earlier on 3. So you saw Doom 2099 eating nerfs, you saw Galacta eating nerfs. Zabu is to some degree responsible for this. But it also means that the power of cards like Shang-Chi and Enchantress is greatly intensified. So let's say you are someone who plays a Devil Dinosaur. You spent 5 energy on that, your opponent spends 3 energy removing it, and they also get to commit stuff to other lanes. That's the dynamic that is causing 5-drops to not be particularly relevant, because there's not really a way to make it so you can play a 5-drop alongside other meaningful threats at this point. Interestingly, one of the things that did allow 5-drops to be better was when we had a busted 1-drop, which was Hydra Bob. 5+1 or 5 and a bob was like an actual legitimate endgame at the time. That is no longer really something that we have. We have a 4-power Hydra Bob, but that really does impact how lane winning your cards can be. This also means that Zabu taking this nerf might potentially open up more space for 5s. And it also might potentially take away from that good stuff shell that everyone complains about. You know what I'm talking about. Zabu, Mr. Fantastic, Surge, Galacta, Gwenpool, Shang-Chi, Enchantress, a bunch of tech cards. That's just kind of been a good deck and keeps getting cards added to it. I think it's high time that cards have been removed from it. I think people are going to look at this change to Bullseye and say it is fundamentally not a change that matters. And I'll generally agree that in the principle of it, like taking 1 power off of Bullseye, not particularly relevant. Bullseye is a card that exists to do the high roll stuff. But I will say this, Strange Supreme lost a point of power, and among other things, did get legitimately worse having lost a point of power, and that's not the kind of card that you ever expect to matter what its actual power is. I'll tell you why I think this does matter, though. The less power a card like this has, the more easy it is to Red Guardian. And I realize Red Guardian himself lost a point of power, but this is a dynamic that I think a lot of players of Bullseye decks will be familiar with. If you get your Bullseye rug pulled, you're losing 8. And it's a lot easier to protect a 3-power card than it is to protect a 2-power card. And I do think that actually does matter. It's going to be sort of fringy. It's not going to be the most relevant thing in the world. And I will say I'm not necessarily shocked that they're hitting Bullseye, but I'm a little surprised that they're doing it now. I personally am of the opinion that I would like decks with identities to be a little bit better. But of those decks with identities, I do think that Bullseye is likely the one that comes the closest to being odious, in the sense that it is often difficult to interact with if you don't have very specific tools. That will likely remain the same, but the efficiency of those tools, by which I mean Red Guardian and also like Lady Deathstrike, which already works, is going to increase against this kind of stuff. Being able to more accurately say, I know I'm hitting the bullseye with this Red Guardian, you are not getting your infinite power output Morbius thing going on here, that does actually matter a lot. And I don't necessarily think that it's a huge deal to the player of discard outside of that specific scenario, which means what they've done with this change is create room for if discard ever becomes a serious problem, there is very meaningful tech against it, which is one of the things that I think has bothered people about discard, that there's not one card that you can run for it. There's just a bunch of different stuff that's situationally useful. I do think that this pushes Red Guardian much more towards this is a one-card solution for this archetype a lot of the time. And it's not going to be the greatest one-card solution, but it's a lot closer than it used to be. A deck with like Red Guardian Morbius is probably going to be pretty good into discard a lot of the time. Being able to shut down like Dakin Grandmaster all-ins is pretty crucial, and I do think that that kind of stuff is increasing the counterplay while not dramatically decreasing the output, I think is probably a good idea. Long overdue change here, not gonna wax poetic about this one. Skills no longer trigger Negasonic. She's already quite a good card. I think this is a very, very real buff because where we talked about how the Bullseye change increased the counterplay while keeping the output the same, this is pretty much doing the same thing, except it's decreasing the counterplay instead of increasing it. Now, you are paying the Negasonic tax. That's just what's happening. I think this card is legit great right now, and with a change like this, is going to be a legitimate player in this metagame. You will see Negasonic. I'm not going to say she's metagame defining, but you're going to see her, and you're going to lose to her. Or, win with her. I like this change to Mirage a lot. One of the things that I have lamented in previous months has been how many of the great 2/3s in this game, or in Mr. Fantastic and Surge's case, 2/2s, how many of the great 2-drops really have just been Season Pass cards, and how previous 2s just simply weren't on that power level. I think this version of Mirage is honestly pretty close, but it's not necessarily about it being better than those cards. It's about it being a worthy replacement for those cards. It's not going to be able to replace something like a Mr. Fantastic because it doesn't do the thing that Mr. Fantastic does. But this card might be able to be a pretty valid budget replacement for Merlin a lot of the time, and I think that does actually matter. If you're playing a deck that scales pretty heavily off of having cards in hand for whatever reason, Kahori stuff, this is now a much more viable budget replacement for Merlin. And I think that's important because I think that the problem that I think is really stark about these Season Pass cards is not just that they're strong, it's that they're unique. There's not necessarily anything that can do what they're doing, but worse. And I think this change to Mirage allows her to be a card that can do what Merlin does, but a lot worse. And it just has to be, the gap between them has to be closed. There are situations where this is just going to be legitimately better than Merlin. It's not a ton of situations, but the situations do exist. This is also a card that might prompt people to play more Victoria Hand, a deck that's silently been getting quite a few buffs recently, with Mirage going to 4-9 as the most recent example before this patch. That is also really interesting because playing Mirage in Victoria Hand Mirrors is one of the most skill-intensive kind of things you can actually do. One of the things that I notice a lot when I play against someone like Husky Puppies, an experienced Victoria Hand player in Mirrors, is that I think he's better at using this card, Mirage, against me than I am using it against him. There's some real nuances in terms of when you want to time this. That also applies to things like maybe you're running up against Mr. Negative. You try to time this at the right spot, right? Throw priority, let them get a Jane, get something that's free, see if you can actually pull it off. There are a lot of cool things that this card can do, and I think it going to 2-3 is long overdue, and I'm excited to see more of her as a fairly generic good 2, because it would just be nice to have a generic good 2 that did not come out of the Season Pass and is not named Surge. I don't really know where they're going with this. Moving the thing to 4-7 is just like, I don't particularly, like, okay. They mentioned it as like a buff to High Evolutionary. I think that's a little out of touch because so they just got a new 4-7. All the high Evo decks are playing Fantasticar. They're not playing this guy. He doesn't say end of turn. I don't get it. I mean, I think one thing that would be cool is if they made Thing an end of turn card, right? Like if they did high Evo Thing and it was just like he punches a guy every turn. But that's pretty much what Cyclops does. So maybe they can't do that. But yeah. I don't know. I feel like this is fundamentally something that will change approximately 0.1% of Marvel Snap games past the beginner level. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't really get what the point of this was other than just being like, well, we can do this, so we might as well. It's Fantastic Four season. It should change absolutely nothing for any viewer of this video. This is just not a card you're going to see. It's really interesting that they choose to buff Marvel Boy now. And I say this as someone who I'm fairly certain within recent weeks was advocating for Marvel Boy to be buffed. I think it's like a card that's good with Clea that recently came out. I think that Marvel Boy in Zoo is something that is really cool. I think that I want players to play more games that involve Marvel Boy type power on the board, even if his numbers are really good. And his numbers are really good because there's some pretty clearly defined weaknesses to what Marvel Boy is trying to do by putting the power onto 1-drops. I think that his nerf was frankly unwarranted. I don't really see the point of it, and I really feel like he could honestly get more than 1 point of power at this point. And all of that is true, except now people are playing him in Fantasticar decks. And it's like, okay, I just feel like of all the times to buff him, there were like 6 months where he was totally unplayed, and now you buff him when he actually is good, and you're actually kind of putting yourself at risk here. I'm not saying that I feel like Marvel Boy is going to be like overpowered or anything, but it feels like a weird time to do it because normally the idea behind buffing a card is we want people to play with this card that they're currently not playing with. And they picked the one time in the last year since Marvel Boy's nerf that people are actually playing the card Marvel Boy to make him stronger. It just seems weird. I'm not saying it's like good or bad. It's just not really how I would have approached this. All of that is to say, I think this is a fine change. I am happy to see more power added to Marvel Boy. I'd be happy to see even more power added to Marvel Boy. I think people are a little bit, I don't know the right word for this. I think people, okay, I'll try to phrase it right. I think people want the Fantasticar deck to be broken so they can be mad about it, and I just don't think it's that good. Like, it's a fine deck, you can play it, but I don't think the deck is, like, whoa, it's Fantasticar. Oh my God, pay to win. It's it's just not. If you want to make a pay to win argument, go talk about Mr. Fantastic First Steps. Do not talk about Fantasticar. To me, this is a card that goes in that deck. And so I kind of expect the reaction to be something along the lines of, look at them buffing the pay to win deck. And I gotta tell you, I don't think that deck is good enough right now. I think it is like a kind of flash in the pan kind of deck that's cool and does a lot of points and is probably very solid at lower levels of play, but I don't see a lot of upside for it at the top end. It is a deck I want to be better. And so I think that even in the context of people already using this card, they have more room to go upwards on that package. I also think that, like, specifically the Clea versions, which are the ones you play with Marvel Boy, are frankly just cool as hell. And I would like to see more of them. And I think that's probably a good thing to happen. This is another card where when we talk about like budget replacements for stuff, I think that making Jennifer Kale better makes her a better budget replacement for a lot of the Herbie type stuff that you might be doing. If you are playing Surfer, this is a great budget replacement for probably any two you're missing, because she will allow you to do what Surfer really wants out of some of its twos, which is play 2/3s on 5. And I think that that is a good thing. I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea that if you're making a season pass card, you want it to be strong and you want it to be fairly generically applicable, because we've seen what happens when they make season pass cards that are weak. Everyone complains about those. And when they make season pass cards that only really go in one deck, everyone complains about those too. So I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea that they should be making strong season pass cards. Whatever, sure. I am opposed to the idea that those cards should be not just strong, but also unique and irreplaceable. And making a card like Jennifer Kale better, we talked about this a little in the Mirage section, makes those cards a little bit less irreplaceable. Is this card going to be better than Surge? No. Can you play it instead of Surge in a Surfer deck? Yeah, probably. Same goes for Herbie. Like, you could probably play this instead of either Surge or Herbie in your Surfer deck, and it'll be worse, but at least it does the thing that you have those cards in there to do, which was previously only available to you at a much worse rate when this card was 2/2. And so I think that increasing a card like this might not be a great thing, but one of the things that I really wish their balance team would look more at was decreasing the gap between the best in slot cards and the other cards that do similar stuff in their role. And I think that this is the kind of thing that they should be doing more of. I feel like Doom 2099 is a bit of a, what's the word? Sample size victim, where when they look at balance, they look at where the meat of the population curve is in Marvel Snap. The meat of the population curve is not at the high end of Infinite. The meat of the population curve is not at the low end of Infinite. The meat of the population curve is probably like rank 60 something. And so that is sort of a consequence. Like, this card getting repeatedly nerfed, I feel like it gets repeatedly nerfed because it is much stronger in, like, people who don't play a lot. If they don't want to think too hard or don't really have the, like, game terminology to, like, focus on this, the cards like that, easy decks, tend to get nerfed a lot more and a lot harder than cards that are, like, very highly involved, sort of move bounce type of stuff, or old Loki, right? But cards like Darkhawk, which rewards you for cope staying because your opponents draw rocks, or Surtur, which is just extremely easy to play, or Doom 2099, cards that just say on the card what the deck is supposed to be and then also how to play it. Those are the cards that constantly get nerfed, much to the consternation of high-end players. And so I think that Doom 2099 has been nerfed to such a degree that I don't think this does a lot for him. But I think like 1 point of power on the bots would actually go a long way, because with Invisible Woman First Steps coming out, there's going to be a lot more to do with the bots, I suspect. But it's not like 1 point of power on him is actively bad by any means. And there are a lot more ways to cheat him out early now with Surge, Mr. Fantastic First Steps. Those are cards that allow you to turn 3 Doom. There are very, very real upsides to a card like this. I just don't think that it has what it takes to compete with the things that are happening right now. the Surfer decks are just going to be bigger numbers, and the disruption that a deck like this can play is generally pushing against what Doom 2099 is able to do. So I guess I wish they had been a little more generous here. They say that they're nervous about Doom 2099, and I get it. Again, it's a very easy deck to play, and they look at a certain slice of balance for when they make these decisions, but I don't expect him to be making any waves at top infinite anytime soon. Green Goblin going to -4 power is probably a little bit overdue, honestly, in large part because they have increased by a lot the amount of ways in which you can counterplay a Green Goblin. There are so many more temporary cards in the game that can temporarily block a spot for Green Goblin to come over. One of the things that was brought up in my Discord, because I don't know if you guys were aware of this, I believe this OTA actually leaked early because of the nature of patches and OTAs at the same time. It was data mined early, I think. And so people were like, why is it okay to buff Green Goblin but not White Widow? And I think that's actually a pretty important thing to talk about. The answer for me is it's okay to buff Green Goblin and not White Widow because Green Goblin is a card that has inherent downside. If that card does not go over, it is sitting there -4ing you. White Widow never had a downside attached to her. That was always the problem, is not just that she cost 2, which was another part of the problem. If Green Goblin cost 2, it'd be much stronger, but that this was a card that you could play and it wouldn't risk messing you up. And I think Clog should always have that kind of risk, because I think that's the kind of thing that makes a Clog deck fun to play against. In as much as there is anything fun about Clog, the feeling of reading correctly where they're going to clog you and leaving their goblins on the other side is that fun. And so I think that that is largely the difference between this card and White Widow, is that White Widow had no real downside. It was never going to lose you the game, and sometimes it would win you the game. Green Goblin can lose you the game if they block it, and that's really notable. This is also a card that has a pretty prominent weakness to Merlin's Polymorph, and people are playing plenty of Annihilus right now. I've even seen people playing Cersei. I've even been the person playing Cersei. So all of that is to say, very acceptable buff to me, and it's a pretty clear difference between this and White Widow. I feel like White Widow is genuinely odious, and I would not try to buff her without trying to figure out how to not make her be the way that she is, because I think fundamentally no downside Clog is always a problem, but Goblin has his downside built in, and so I think it's very okay. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and nothing can change that. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see ya tomorrow.